The stranger came in out of the storm an hour before midnight, and Sorrel knew, before he had crossed the threshold, that he was going to change her life, though she could not have said, then, whether for the better or the ruin of it. She was closing the common room of the weatherwain when he came, banking the fire, turning the last of the mugs, doing the small closing things she had done 10,000 times, alone, because she was always the last one down, and had been for 2 years, since the fever took her husband and left her the inn, and the empty bed, and the long habit of being the last light burning on the moor road. The storm had come down off the high country at dusk, one of the hard autumn storms that shut the road for a night and emptied the inn of even the local men, and she had thought herself alone with it, alone with the rain hammering the slates and the wind finding every gap in the old timbers, when the door blew open on a gust and a man was standing in it, rain black and still, with the storm at his back, looking at her across the guttering firelight, as though he had come a very long way to find exactly her. She was not a woman who frightened easily. 2 years of keeping a lone inn on a moor road had burned the easy fright out of her, and she had a stout bar for the door, and a cool head, and no illusions about the kinds of men the road sometimes brought. But she looked at the stranger in the doorway, with the rain running off him, and the storm howling behind him, and the cool head she was so proud of went, for a moment, entirely still, because there was something about him that did not fit any of the kinds of men she knew. He was not a drover, or a peddler, or a soldier, or any of the road's usual traffic. He was too still. He held himself the way nothing on the moor road held itself, the way, she thought later, a great cat holds itself, or a king, some creature so entirely certain of its own strength that it had no need to show it. And his eyes, when they found her across the room, were not a traveler's eyes. They were older than the rest of him somehow, and they had a strange sheen in the firelight, an animal catch of the light that was gone when he blinked, and Sorrel stood with the last mug in her hand, and felt her heart going in a way that was not quite fear, and not quite anything she had a name for. "The storms shut the pass," the stranger said. His voice was low and did not carry the way a voice should have to over the wind. It seemed to arrive at her without crossing the room. "I'll need a bed, and dry clothes if you have a man's to spare, and whatever's left of your fire. I can pay." And Sorrel, who had told 100 late travelers that the inn was full, or the kitchen closed, or the road better tried in the morning, who had every reason on that black night to bar her door against a stranger she could not place, heard herself say, instead, against all her hard-won caution, "Come in out of it, then, before you drown on my threshold. There's fire, and there's stew, and my husband's clothes will fit you near enough." She did not know why she said it. She turned it over for months afterward, that unguarded yes, and never fully understood it. Only that when he looked at her, something in her had answered, before her sense could get a word in. Some deep thing under her caution that had recognized him, though she had never in her life seen him before, and had said come in before the rest of her could say don't. She did not know. This was the whole of what came after, the thing everything turned on, that she had just opened her door to the most feared man in the known world, and that the deep thing in her that had answered him was older and truer than any caution, and that neither of their lives would ever, after that night, be entirely their own again. Her name was Sorrel, and she was 26 years old, and she had been 2 years a widow, keeping an inn alone on the loneliest road in the Low Country, and to understand the night that changed her, you have to understand the 2 quiet years that came before it, because it was the quiet that made her ready, though she did not know she was waiting for anything at all. She had not been born to the inn. She had come to it at 20 by way of marriage, a good enough marriage, to a decent enough man named Aldous. No, to a decent enough man named Corin, the Weatherwain's keeper, a kind, steady older man who had wanted a young wife to share the long work of a road inn, and had found in Sorrel a girl with no family left, and a great deal of quiet competence, and no better prospect than to say yes. She had not loved him, not the way the ballads meant, but she had been fond of him, and grateful to him, and she had made him a good wife for the 6 years they had, keeping his books, and brewing his ale, and learning his trade until she knew the weathervane better than he did. And when the winter fever took him, quick and unfair, in the space of a single hard week, she had grieved him honestly, and had then done the thing everyone expected her to fail at, which was to keep the inn herself, alone, a lone woman on a moor road, and to keep it well. The fever had taught her the thing she built the whole of her caution on, and it is worth telling, because it is the wound the storm stranger walked into. Corin had sickened on a Tuesday, and been dead by the next 7 days. A strong, steady man turned to nothing in a week, while Sorel nursed him, and could do nothing. And the helplessness of it, the sitting by a bed watching a person you were fond of be taken, unable to buy or bargain or work your way out of it, had done something to her that the grief itself had not. It had taught her that to love a thing was to hand the world a stick to beat you with, that everything you let yourself need could be taken in 7 days by a fever you never saw coming, and that the only safe thing, the only sane thing, was to need nothing, and love nothing, and want nothing you could not bear to watch die. She had not decided this in words. No one decides such a thing in words, but her body had learned it in that 7-day week, and she had built her 2 walled years on it, without ever once naming the foundation. And it was the truest reason she turned the sniffing suitors away, and the truest reason she kept the last light burning for travelers who never stayed. And the truest reason a storm stranger who listened by her fire was so dangerous, because he was exactly the thing 2 years had taught her never again to let herself need, and she had let him in anyway, and some deep ungovernable part of her had known, letting him in, that she was handing the world the stick again, and had done it anyway, for the first time since the fever, because 2 years of safety had turned out to be its own slow kind of dying. She had kept it 2 years. She had turned away the men who came sniffing after a widow with a property, the ones who offered marriage as a kindness and meant it as a seizure, and she had turned away the ones who thought a lone woman's inn was a thing to be taken by a hard look and a raised voice. And she had earned, slowly, a hard, small reputation on the road, that the Weatherwane's widow was fair and steady and not to be pushed, that her ale was good and her beds were clean, and her patience for foolishness was short. It was not a bad life, she told herself, most days, that it was not a bad life. But it was a walled one, a careful one, a life she had built out of caution, the way a person builds a wall out of stones, one wary refusal at a time, and somewhere in the 2nd year she had come to understand a thing about herself that she did not like and could not fix, that she had grown so good at keeping herself safe that she had stopped, almost entirely, being alive. She wanted nothing, because wanting had a way of breaching the wall. She hoped for nothing, because the fever had taught her what hope cost. She kept the inn, and banked the fire, and slept alone in the wide bed, and rose and did it all again, and she was safe, and she was competent, and she was, though she would not have said the word even to herself, unbearably lonely, in the particular way of a person who has walled the loneliness up so well that even she can no longer hear it calling. There was a particular loneliness to the last light hours that she never spoke of to anyone, because there was no one to speak of it to, and that was itself the whole of the thing. Every night for 2 years she had been the last one awake on the moor road, the last light in the last inn on the last stretch of road before the empty high country, and she had come to feel it as a kind of post she kept. A watch she stood, the lone keeper of the last warm room before the dark. On the good nights she had told herself it was a fine thing, a useful thing, that a light kept burning on a lonely road was a mercy to whatever cold traveler might need it. On the bad nights she had understood it for what it also was, that she had made herself into a light for other people's comfort, precisely so that she would never have to notice she had no one to keep a light for her. She banked the fire each night for travelers, who mostly never came, and climbed the stair to the wide, cold bed alone, and lay listening to the rain on the slates, and did not let herself finish the thought that always started, in the dark, about how long a person could go on being the warm room no one stayed in. She was very good at not finishing that thought. She had 2 years' practice, and she did not know, could not have known, that the not finishing was itself the wall, and that the wall was about to be walked straight through by a man who had spent his own life not finishing the very same thought, in a black stone hall 100 leagues north. And into that walled quiet, on a black storm night, out of the whole wide world, came a stranger, who looked at her as though he had crossed it to find her. She fed him, and gave him her husband's clothes, and sat with him by the fire, while the storm broke itself against the inn, and somewhere in the long hours of that night, the wall she had spent 2 years building came down, stone by stone, so gently that she did not feel it fall until it was already down. It was not what she would have expected, if she had ever let herself expect such a thing. He did not press her. That was the first strange thing. The thing that undid her caution more thoroughly than any charm could have. A dangerous man alone, with a lone woman on a storm-shut night. She had braced for the thing such men do, the pushing, the assuming, the slow closing of distance that a woman on the road learns to feel coming, and it did not come. He sat across her fire in her dead husband's dry shirt, and he talked to her, quietly, and he listened, and the listening was the thing, because no one had listened to Sorrel in 2 years, no one had asked her a question about herself, and then been quiet and let her answer it, and she found, to her own astonishment, that she was talking, really talking, in a way she had not talked to a living soul since Corin died, telling this stranger the small true things she had walled up, the loneliness of the road, the weight of the empty bed, the strange grief of keeping alive a place her husband had loved. The way she had grown so careful she had half forgotten how to want anything at all. She did not know why she told him. She thought about it for months. The nearest she came to understanding it was that he listened the way the storm listened, entirely, without judgment, without wanting anything from her answers, and that after 2 years behind a careful wall, a person will tell the whole of herself to the first one who simply, wholly, listens. And he told her things too, though she understood only later how carefully he had chosen what to tell and what to withhold. He did not tell her his name, he did not tell her where he was from, or where he was going, or what he was, and she did not ask, because it seemed, that night, not to matter, because there was a thing happening between them across the fire that was larger than names, a recognition, a rightness, a sense she could not shake that this stranger, who had come in out of the storm, was somehow the most familiar person she had ever met, that she had known him always, that the deep thing in her that had said come in was still speaking, low and certain, under all their quiet talk, saying yes, and yes, and yes. He told her instead the shapes of things without their names. That he ruled, in a hard, far place, over hard people, and that ruling them had made him lonely in a way he had never once spoken aloud to anyone. That he had spent his whole life being the strongest and most feared thing in every room he entered, and had found that being feared and being known were opposite things, that no one who feared him had ever once simply talked to him by a fire the way she was talking to him now. That he had ridden out from his hard, far kingdom on a matter of grim business, alone, in disguise, and had been caught by the storm on a moor road, and had come to a lit inn expecting nothing, and had found, and here he stopped, and looked at her across the fire with those strange old catchlight eyes, and did not finish the sentence, and did not need to, because Sorrel had found the same thing he had, and the not finishing of the sentence was the truest thing either of them had said all night. There was a moment, late in the talk, before anything else, that Sorrel kept ever after as the truest of the whole night, truer even than what came after it. The fire had burned low, and the storm had settled into a steady drumming on the slates, and she had told him a thing she had never told a living soul, the thing about being the last light on the dead road, and keeping it burning so she would not have to notice no one kept a light for her. And he had been quiet a long moment, and then he had said, low, looking into her low fire, "I know that light. I keep it too. I've kept it so long I forgot it was a thing I was doing." And she had understood in that moment that whatever else this stranger was, he was the first person in 2 years, perhaps the first person ever, who had not needed the thing about the light explained, who had simply known it, from the inside, because he carried the same one. And something in her that had been clenched shut since a 7-day fever had, in that moment, quietly let go. It was not desire, that letting go, though desire came. It was relief. The bone-deep relief of a person who has been alone in a particular way for so long that she believed the way itself was hers alone, discovering, on a storm night, across a low fire, that there was one other person in the world who had been alone in exactly the same way, and that the two of them had found each other, against all the odds of a wide, dark world, in a lit inn on a dead road in a storm. That was the thing that undid her caution, in the end, not his strangeness, his sameness. What passed between them then is not a thing this tale will lay bare, because some things are the two people's own, and not the world's, and it was never, whatever the world later made of it, a cheap thing or a careless one. It was two walled and lonely people who had each, on a storm night, met the one other person who could see over the wall. And the wall came down, both walls, and they were, for one night, out of the whole of their careful guarded lives, simply and entirely known. She did not think of it as a mistake, then or ever. She thought of it, always, even through everything that came after, as the one night in 2 walled years that she had been fully alive. And somewhere in the deep of it, in the dark with the rain on the slates, a thing happened that neither of them named, because Sorrel did not have the knowledge to name it, and the stranger, who did, chose in that moment not to. A thing older than either of them, a recognition in the blood, a bond of the old kind sealing itself between a feared king and an innkeeper's widow who did not know what he was. He knew, she would understand, much later, that he had known exactly what was happening, and had let it happen, had not been able to stop it or want to. That an alpha of the old blood who finds his true mate does not choose it any more than a river chooses the sea. But he did not tell her. That was the one thing she could never quite forgive and never quite blame him for, that he had let the oldest bond in the world seal itself in her without telling her it was happening. Because, he said much later, low and honest, he had had one night of being simply known, and had not been able to bear breaking it by telling her the truth of what he was, and had told himself he would come back and tell her properly, and had not known, that night, the grim business that would keep him from coming back for the better part of a year. He was gone before she woke. That was the storm's last cruelty and his own, that she woke in the gray after-storm light to a cold place beside her, and an inn gone quiet, and a stranger vanished as though the night had dreamed him. But he had not vanished cleanly, and this was the thing that told her, in the empty gray morning, that whatever the night had been, it had not been nothing to him either. He had left his cloak. His own cloak, the gray travel-worn cloak he had come in out of the storm wearing, folded over the foot of the bed where she could not miss it, a thing a man does not forget, a thing left on purpose, left for her, the one thing of himself he could leave without a name attached. And tucked into its folds, where her searching hands found it, a token, a plain iron ring, old and worn and heavy, with a mark cut into it she did not know, a thing that looked like nothing, and weighed, in her palm, like something, and beside it, in a hand that had clearly hurried, 3 words on the back of one of her own inn receipts, the only words he left her, "I will return." She did not believe it. That was the sensible thing, the thing 2 years of caution told her, that men say I will return on the backs of receipts, on their way out of storm-shut inns, and that a wise woman folds the cloak away and forgets the night and goes back to banking her own fire. She told herself she believed nothing, expected nothing, had had one strange night out of 2 walled years, and would let it be one strange night and no more. She put the iron ring on a cord around her neck, under her dress, where no one would see it, and she told herself it meant nothing. It was only that a widow keeps things, that it was foolish to throw away good iron. She hung the gray cloak in the back of the press behind her own, and told herself it was only that a spare cloak is useful on a cold road. And she went back to the inn, and banked the fire, and rose and did it all again, and told herself the wall was back up, and the strange night had changed nothing at all. She was wrong, and the way she came to know she was wrong was the strangest and most frightening part of the whole thing, because it began in her own body, and she had no way in the world to understand it. The restlessness came first, and it came within days, and it did not go away. She could not settle. That was the plainest way she could put it to herself, in the weeks after the storm, and it frightened her, because she had been, for 2 years, the most settled woman on the moor road, a person who had made stillness into a whole way of living. Now she could not sit through an evening. She paced the common room after the last mug was turned the way she had never paced in her life, a restless pull under her ribs that would not let her be, a sense of some direction she ought to be going, some place she ought to be, that she could not name and could not reach. She slept badly, and when she slept she dreamed of a hard far country she had never seen. Mountains, and a black stone hall, and a cold that was not the moor's cold, and woke with the iron ring warm against her breastbone, and the restlessness worse, not better, for the dreaming. She lost her taste for the food she had always liked, and could not say why. She would stop, in the middle of the ordinary work of the inn, with a mug in her hand or a ledger open, and find herself standing at the door looking out at the moor road running away toward the high country, north, always north, with a longing in her so strong and so nameless that it frightened her, a homesickness for a place she had never been, and a person she did not have a name for. And there was the matter of the inn itself, which she found, in those strange weeks, she could no longer feel about the way she had. For 2 years the weathervane had been her whole world and her whole armor, the walls she hid behind, the work that filled the hours, the light she kept so she would not have to notice the dark. Now she walked its rooms, and felt, for the first time, how small they were, how much they were a shell she had grown to fit, and had, without noticing, outgrown. She caught herself resenting the very thing that had saved her, the careful walled life, the way a person half-woken resents the warm bed that would keep her sleeping. It frightened her more than the dreams did. The dreams she could tell herself were only dreams. But the slow turning of her own heart against the safe life she had built so carefully, that felt like a betrayal of the woman she had been for 2 years, and she did not understand that it was not a betrayal at all, but the plainest thing in the world. That a wall, once something has come over it, can never again be quite the comfort it was. That a person who has been known even once cannot go back to being content with never being known. She had had one night of being seen over the wall, and the wall, which had been her whole safety, had become, in a single night, her whole prison, and the restlessness under her ribs was, in part, simply this: the deep thing in her, that had been let out for one night, refusing, now, to be walled back in. She thought, at first, that she was ill. Then she thought, in a darker hour, that she was going mad, that 2 years of walled loneliness had finally cracked something, and one strange night had been the crack's beginning. She went, in the end, half ashamed, to the one person on the moor road she trusted with a strange thing, which was old Maud. Maud kept the herb croft at the edge of the village, an ancient, blunt, plain-spoken woman who had birthed and buried 3 generations of the Low Country, and knew more of the old ways than she ever said, and who had taken a rough liking to the Weatherwane's widow years back, and never troubled to explain why. She listened to the whole of it, the restlessness, the northward longing, the dreams of a country never seen, with her sharp old eyes narrowing, and she did not laugh, and she did not call it madness. And when Sorrel had finished, the old woman was quiet a long moment, and then she said, slowly, in the flat way she said the things that mattered, "Show me the ring." And Sorrel, startled, for she had told no one of the ring, drew it out from under her dress on its cord, the plain heavy iron with the strange mark cut in it, and Maud took it in her old fingers and looked at the mark for a long time, and her face did a thing Sorrel had never seen it do, went pale and old, and almost afraid, and she pressed the ring back into Sorrel's hand as though it had grown hot. "Where did you get this?" Maud said, low. "The truth, girl, all of it." And Sorrel told her, the storm, the stranger, the one night, the vanishing, the cloak and the ring, and the 3 words. And old Maud listened with her pale face getting older, and when it was done she sat a while in her herb-smelling croft with her hands folded, and did not speak, and then she said the thing that turned Sorrel's blood to water. "I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you plain, because you've a right to know a thing that's already been done to you." She tapped the ring in Sorrel's palm. "That mark is old. Older than this village, older than the Low Country. It's a wolf mark, girl, the sign of the old blood, the wolf kingdoms of the far north, the ones we don't speak of down here, because we like to pretend they're only a story to frighten children. They're not a story. They're real, and they're north, past the high country, in the hard mountains, and they're ruled by alphas. The old wolf blood, the true and terrible kind. And this mark, this exact mark, I've seen once in my long life, on a thing my own grandmother kept, and she told me what it was, and I'll tell you." Her old eyes fixed Sorrel's, and did not let go. "It's the mark of the Wolf King. Not a Wolf King. The Wolf King. The high seat of the north. The most feared throne in the whole of the world, the one the very packs speak of with dread. And a man who left you this ring, girl, and 3 words, and could not stay. A man who caught the storm on a road in disguise, and looked at you the way you say he looked at you, and could not settle after, and left the mark of the northern high seat folded in his cloak." She stopped, and made herself say it. "That was no drover, Sorrel. And the restlessness in you, the northward pull, the dreams of a country you've never seen. That's not a sickness, and it's not madness. That's a bond, the old kind, the kind their blood makes and can't unmake. He's marked you, girl, whether you knew what was happening or not, and the pull you feel is you feeling him, 100 leagues north, feeling you feel him, and there is no herb in my croft, or anyone's that will cure it, because it isn't a wound, it's a tie. You've been bound, without your knowing, to the most feared man alive." And Sorrel sat in the herb croft with the iron ring warm in her hand, and the northward pull under her ribs, suddenly, terribly, named, and understood that the one strange night she had told herself changed nothing, had changed everything, and that the stranger she had let in out of the storm had left more than a cloak behind, and that somewhere in the hard mountains of the north, the most feared man in the world was, at that very moment, feeling her the way she felt him, and had written "I will return," and had meant it. He came back in the spring, and he did not come back the way he had left, alone and in disguise on a storm night. He came back as what he was, and the whole of the Low Country knew it, days before he reached the Weatherwain, because the most feared king in the world does not cross the high country quietly. What Sorrel did not know, through the long half-year of her nameless longing, was that the man she longed toward was in a worse case than she was, and that his half-year had been the harder of the 2. For Varick had ridden north from the Weatherwain at dawn, meaning, truly, to return within the month, meaning to settle the grim border business that had brought him south in disguise, and then to come back and tell the innkeeper's widow, properly, without a storm hurrying them, exactly what he was, and exactly what had happened between them in the dark. He had not reckoned on the war. The border business had not settled. It had caught fire, into a hard winter war among the northern packs that a wolf king could not leave without losing his kingdom. And so Varric had been held in the north through the whole of the season, fighting a war he did not care about, while the bond he had let seal itself dragged at him day and night, a constant southward ache, the pull of a woman 100 leagues away who did not know what he was, and must, he was certain, be thinking him a liar. He had felt her restlessness through the tie, the way she felt his. He had known, all winter, that somewhere south a woman was pacing a lonely inn and longing toward a country she had never seen, and cursing, no doubt, the stranger who had left her 3 lying words on the back of a receipt. And he could not go. It had made him, his own war marshal said, more terrible that winter than anyone had ever seen him. A king fighting with a fury that had nothing to do with the war, and everything to do with a moor road inn he could not reach. And when the war at last broke, and the passes cleared with the spring, Varric had not even waited to hear the terms sworn. He had ridden south the same day, with his host behind him, because a king cannot ride the Low Country alone twice, driven by a half-year's held longing toward the one lit inn on the one dead road where, he could only pray, a green stubborn woman had kept, against all sense, a light burning for him. Word ran ahead of him down the moor road, like water down a gully, that a host had come down out of the northern mountains, that the Wolf King himself rode at the head of it, the old blood, the terrible high seat of the north, that the Low Country had told itself was only a story, and that he was riding, of all the impossible directions, south and west, toward the poor moor villages that had nothing a king could want, as though he were looking for something. Sorrel heard it from a shaking peddler, and then from the village, and then from Maud, who came to the inn on her old legs faster than Sorrel had ever seen her move, and she heard it all with the iron ring burning against her breastbone, and the northward pull under her ribs turning, day by day, as he came south, from a pull into a blaze, and she understood, with a certainty that owed nothing to the peddler's tales, that the Wolf King had not come south for a village, or a throne, or a war. He had come for her. She could feel him coming. The bond that had been a nameless ache for half a year had become, as he crossed the high country, a living thread drawing tight, and she stood at the door of the Weatherwain, looking north up the moor road, exactly as she had stood looking north for half a year, except that now the north was answering. Now the thing she had longed toward was coming down the road to meet her, and she did not know whether to bar the door or fling it wide, and in the end she did neither, because she had learned, on one storm night, that when the deep thing in her spoke she had best listen, and the deep thing in her was not saying run. He came to the Weatherwain at dusk, and this time there was no storm, only the long gold spring light on the moor, and he came at the head of his host, but he came the last stretch alone, on foot, up the road to her door, the way a man comes who does not want to frighten a thing he has come a long way to find. And Sorrel stood in her own doorway, where he had first stood in the storm with the roles reversed, and watched the most feared man in the world walk up her road in the gold light, and saw him clearly for the first time, not the rain-black stranger of the storm, but the Wolf King himself, tall and hard and certain, with the catchlight in his eyes that she now understood, the old blood, the terrible high seat, walking up a moor road to an innkeeper's widow, with an expression on his hard face that was not a king's at all, that was uncertain, that was almost afraid, the look of a man who has ridden south for half a year, not knowing whether the woman he bound himself to will meet him with open arms or a barred door. The whole village had come out to see it, and hidden, because a Wolf King's host on the moor road was a thing to hide from, but Sorrel did not hide. She stood in her own doorway, in plain sight, an innkeeper's widow before the terror of the north, and old Maud stood a little behind her, the only other soul in the Low Country who was not afraid, and the two women watched the most feared man in the world come up the road on foot, and Maud said, low, at Sorel's shoulder, in her flat, blunt way, "Feet, not horse." He's left the host behind and come the last of it on his own 2 feet, up a road to a woman, like a suitor and not a king. Mind that, girl. Whatever else he says, a man who could ride up and take a thing, walking up humble to ask for it instead. That's the whole of what you need to know about which kind of man the storm blew you. And then she had stepped back into the inn, and left Sorrel her doorway, the way the old and the wise know to step back at the last, and leave the young their own moment to meet. He stopped a little way off, leaving her the distance, and he said, into the gold quiet, the first true thing he had ever told her, the thing he had withheld on the storm night. My name is Varric. I am the king of Valmark, the high seat of the north, and I am the thing your low country tells children about to frighten them, and every fearful thing they say of me is true, or was, before a storm shut a pass, and I came into a lit inn expecting nothing. He drew a breath, and the hard certain king was gone for a moment, and only the man from the fire remained. I did not tell you what I was, that night, and I have hated myself for it every day of the half-year since, because I let the oldest bond in the world seal itself in you without your knowing, and that was a thing done to you and not with you, and you had every right to it, and I stole it. I told myself I would come back and tell you properly within the month. I was wrong. There was a war in the north I could not leave, and it held me half a year, and every day of it I felt you here, feeling me, and could not come, and it was the worst half-year of a hard life. He looked at her, and left the whole of the distance for her to keep or close. I have come to tell you the truth I owed you, and then to ask you a thing, and whatever you answer freely, because I have already done you one wrong by not letting you choose, and I will not do you a second. So here is the truth. You are bound to me, and I to you, by the old blood, and it cannot be unmade, and I would not unmake it if it could. And here is the ask. Come north with me. Be what the bond has made you. Be the queen of the most feared kingdom in the world. And he stood in the gold light with his host behind him, and his heart, plainly, in his hands, and waited, a king who could have taken anything in the world by force, waiting on the yes or no of an innkeeper's widow, because it was the one thing his terrible strength could not seize. And Sorrel, who had spent half a year longing north toward exactly this man, and had felt the bond draw tight as he came, who wanted, with the whole of the deep thing in her, to say yes and be done, did not say yes. Not yet. Because she had spent 2 years before the storm, learning what it cost to hand herself over, and she was not, whatever her blood said, going to hand herself over even to this. You left a ring and 3 words on the back of a receipt, she said, and her voice shook but did not break. And then you vanished for half a year while I thought I was going mad, feeling a pull I had no name for toward a man I couldn't have named. And I want you to know, before I say anything else, exactly what that half year was, so you never do a thing like it to me again. It was cruel. You may not have meant it cruel, and I believe you didn't, but a thing can be cruel that no one meant, and being bound to a stranger without being told is cruel, king or no king. She saw it land, saw the hard face take it, and she went on, because she had learned that her silence had always been the wall she hid behind, and she was done hiding. So here is my condition, and you'll swear to it before I set one foot on the North Road, because a woman who's been bound without her leave has earned the right to set the terms of everything after. You'll never again decide a thing about my life, and tell me after. Not the bond, not the North, not the crown, not the smallest thing. Whatever we are to each other, we are it as 2 people who ask each other, or we are nothing, and I'll take the ache of the broken bond over a lifetime of being a thing that's decided about, because I had 2 years of learning to want nothing, and I'd rather go back to the wall than be handed a crown I never got to choose. She lifted her chin, an innkeeper's widow setting terms to the terror of the North. Swear that whatever the blood made without asking either of us, everything after this evening gets asked, and then, and here, her voice did break, just slightly, because the deep thing in her had been longing toward this for half a year and would not be entirely denied. And then ask me again, and I'll give you an answer you'll like. And Varric, king of Valmark, the high seat of the north, the most feared man in the world, looked at the woman who had let him in out of a storm, and then, half a year later, in the gold light, refused to be swept off her own threshold even by the thing that had bound them. And something moved in his hard face that no enemy had ever put there. The astonished respect of a terrible king for the one person alive who would not be terrified of him, and he inclined his head, once, slowly, the way the old blood acknowledges a thing it did not expect to find. "I swear it," he said. "Every choice that's yours, you'll make, and I'll ask before I so much as move you from a room. You have my word, and my word has held the whole terrible north through wars your low country will never hear of. It'll hold for one innkeeper who bargained better than any king I've faced." And then, because she had told him to, he asked her again, plainly, in the gold light, the great question, leaving it wholly in her hands: would she come north, freely, and be his queen? And Sorrel, who had chosen once on a storm night against all her caution, and had been right, chose again, in the spring light, with her eyes open this time, and the terms set in her own words, and said yes, and meant it, and the bond that had been half a year an ache turned, in the saying, into a thing chosen, which is the only kind of bond worth having. Vielmark was nothing like the Low Country, and it was, at first, everything the tales had promised and everything Sorel had feared. A hard, high kingdom of black stone and cold mountains, where the wind never entirely stopped, and the people were carved out of the same dark rock as their halls, wary and strong and slow to warm, ruled from a great black stone seat by a king they feared more than they loved. She came into it in the tail of spring, up out of the green low country into the grey heights, and she felt the whole of her old caution rise up and tell her she had made a terrible mistake, that she did not belong in this cold, hard place, that she was an innkeeper's widow playing at a crown. And she would have turned around on the north road more than once if the bond had not been drawing her on, and Varric had not been riding, always, a careful pace ahead, leaving her the room to come at her own speed. She did not at first sleep in the great cold rooms they gave her. That was the thing that told her, in her first hard weeks in Valmark, how much of the low country woman she still was, that a queen's chambers of black stone and rich furs frightened her more than they comforted, that she lay awake in them missing the small, warm, ordinary rooms of the Weatherwain, the sound of rain on slates, the smell of her own banked fire. And Varric, who felt everything she felt through the bond and had sworn to ask rather than assume, did the thing that began, more than any grand gesture could have, to win her. He asked her what she was missing, plainly, and listened to the whole small homesick answer of it, and then, without ceremony, had a fire built in her cold rooms of the low sort she was used to, and had the great shutters left open on the wet nights so she could hear the rain on the black stone roof, and brought her, from somewhere, a rough low chair like the ones in her own common room, because she had mentioned, once, that she could not sit at ease in a throne-room chair. It was nothing. It was everything. It was a terrible king learning, one small homesick thing at a time, the shape of what a lonely woman needed to feel safe, and doing each of them without being asked twice. And Sorrel lay in her Valmark rooms on the wet nights, listening to the rain on the black stone, the way she had listened to it on her own slates the night he first came, and felt the cold, hard kingdom become, one rainfall at a time, a place she might be able to live. He taught her Valmark the way another man might teach a language, and this was the slow thing, the domestic thing, and it was the whole of how they came truly to love each other, past the bond, as two people and not two bloodlines. For the bond, Sorrel came to understand, was not love. That was a thing the tales got wrong, and a thing she had to learn slowly and painfully in her first Valmark year. The old blood had tied them, yes, had made an ache and a pull and a knowing, but the tie was only a tie. It made them able to feel each other, drawn to each other, unable to be truly at peace apart, but it did not of itself make them know each other, or trust each other, or love each other. And Sorrel was fiercely glad of that, because it meant that whatever grew between them past the bond would be a thing they built, and not a thing the blood had done to them without asking, and she had had enough, for one lifetime, of things done to her without asking. So she set herself, in Valmark, to the slow work of actually coming to know the man the storm had bound her to, and he, understanding, met her in it, and the two of them courted each other, in that cold, high kingdom, as carefully and as slowly as if there had been no bond at all, as if they were two strangers with all the time in the world, which was, Sorrel thought, exactly the right way to do it, and exactly the thing the bond might have let them skip, and would have been the poorer for skipping. There was a night, early in that first Valmark year, that she came to think of as the true beginning of it, not the storm, not the threshold, but a plain cold night, when she could not sleep, and went walking the black halls and found the king awake too, alone in a cold gallery with the mountain wind at the windows, and neither of them ruling anything, just two people awake in a hard place in the dark. And she had sat with him, as she had sat with the stranger by her fire, and they had talked, low, the way they had that first night, and she had understood that the storm night had not been a spell or an accident of the bond, but simply the two of them, that this was who they were together when the walls were down, that they were, under the terror and the caution, two people who could talk to each other in the dark until the sky grayed and never run out of the quiet true things to say. It was that night, and not the bond, that she first let herself think the word she had been refusing, and she thought it and did not run from it, sitting in the cold gallery, with the wind at the glass, and the terror of the north telling her, haltingly, in the dark, the story of his own walled and lonely life, and she understood that she was not, whatever the tales said, a woman claimed by a wolf king's bond, but a woman falling, of her own free heart, in her own good time, for a lonely man she had chosen to come to know. She learned him in the small things. She learned that the most feared man in the world took no wine, that he slept badly, that he had ruled Volmark alone since he was very young and had made himself hard the way you make a blade hard, by fire and hammering, and had paid for it in a loneliness so complete that a single night at a stranger's fire had cracked something in him that a decade of ruling had sealed. She learned that he was, under the terrible king, dry and quiet and unexpectedly kind, that he knew every one of his hard people by name, and carried their troubles more heavily than they knew, that the fear they held him in was a wall between him and the whole world, and that he had hated it, secretly, for years, without ever being able to say so, because a wolf king who admits he is lonely is a wolf king inviting a challenge. She learned, in short, that Varric of Valmark had spent his whole life exactly as walled in as she had spent her 2 widowed years, that the terror of the north and the widow of the moor road were the same kind of creature under it all, two people who had built such good walls out of such real griefs that they had nearly forgotten they were lonely, and that each of them had, on a storm night, met the one person who could see over the wall, and that this, and not the bond, was the true thing between them. And she gave him, in return, the thing no one in Valmark had ever dared give him. She was not afraid of him. She had known him first as a rain-soaked stranger at her fire, before she knew he was the terror of the north, and she could never entirely unknow it, could never look at him and see only the wolf king, because she had seen him wet and tired and lonely in her dead husband's shirt, and so she spoke to him the way no one in his hard kingdom spoke to him, plainly, sometimes sharply, teasing him, contradicting him, treating the most feared man in the world like a man, and it was this, more than her yes on the threshold, more than the bond, that made Varric love her past all reason, because a person who has been feared his whole life and longed, secretly, to be simply known, will love beyond measure the one soul who looks at him and is not afraid. There were the small rituals, and the small rituals were the whole of it, because a life is written in its small rituals and not its great events. There was the rain. He had learned, that first homesick season, that the sound of rain on the roof settled her as nothing else could. that it was the sound of the night he first came, and the sound of her whole low-country life. And he had taken, on the dry nights when Valmark's hard sky gave no rain, to leaving the great shutters open anyway so she could hear the mountain wind, and had said once, gruffly, when she caught him at it, that a man could learn to like a sound if it was the sound the person he loved slept easy to. There was the iron ring, the plain heavy ring he had left folded in his cloak, which she wore still, on its cord, under her queen's finery, and which he had noticed, one evening, resting against her breastbone where the rich collars could not hide it, and had reached out and touched, once, with a strange look on his hard face, and said only, "You kept it." Half a year of thinking me a liar, and you kept it. And she had said, "I kept it because it was good iron, and a widow keeps things," and they had both known that was not the reason, and had let the not saying be the truest thing said that evening. There was the way he brought her, from the far south trade, the small green things that would not grow in the north. A lemon once, a handful of the soft, low-country apples she had grown up on, and set them by her without ceremony and without a word, and watched her face when she found them, learning by heart the small things that made a walled woman glad. And there was the way, over the seasons, that the careful distance between them in the cold rooms drew slowly closer, not by any decision, only by the arithmetic of two people who keep leaning in, until an evening came when she fell asleep against his shoulder over a book, and woke to find he had not moved for hours, had sat still as stone the whole night rather than wake her, a terror king turned to a pillow by a sleeping widow, and had banked the low fire before he let himself sleep. Old Maud had told her, before she left the low country, a blunt last thing, pressing a sprig of dried sorrel into her hand, the bitter green herb she was named for, that grew wild on the moor, and saying, in her flat way, "You're going to a cold place, girl, to a hard man, and you'll be tempted to go hard and cold to match it, because that's what caution does, it dresses you like the danger. Don't. The thing that man needs, that whole kingdom needs, isn't another hard, cold thing. It's the green, bitter, stubborn thing that grows where nothing should. That's you. That's what you always were, keeping a light on a dead road, feeding a bird, letting a stranger in from the storm when every sense said bar the door. Don't you dare go hard to survive that place. Stay green. It's the only thing you've got that they haven't." And Sorrel had kept the sprig of sorrel, pressed in the leaves of the small book she carried north, and in her hardest Valmark hours, she took it out and looked at it, and remembered to stay green, and it was the truest counsel anyone ever gave her. Maud had said one more thing, at the very last, walking Sorrel to the edge of the herb croft in the grey morning of her leaving, and it was the thing Sorrel turned over most often in the north. "You'll want to know," the old woman had said, blunt as ever, "whether it's real, whether he loves you, or whether it's only the blood tie dragging him, and dragging you, and none of it chosen. You'll lie awake on it. So I'll tell you how you'll know, and then you can stop lying awake." She had fixed Sorrel with her sharp old eye. The tie makes you feel each other. It doesn't make him kind. It doesn't make him ask before he moves you. It doesn't make him leave the shutters open because you like the rain, or sit still all night so you can sleep. The blood can't do a single one of those things. Those are a man choosing, every day, in the small ways, and no tie in the world can fake them, or force them. So don't you watch whether he wants you, girl. The blood'll see to the wanting. You watch whether he's kind in the small things, whether he asks, whether he does the little unforced daily work of it. That's the part that's real, because that's the part the blood can't do for him. If he's kind in the small things, he loves you, and if he's not, then it's only the tie, and you come home to my croft, and we'll find a way to bear it together. And Sorrel had carried that north as the measure of everything, and had watched, and had found him kind in the small things, over and over, in the shutters and the ring and the low chair and the green things from the south, and had known, by Maud's plain test, long before the black peak, that it was real. The test came before the confession did, as it so often does, because a hard kingdom does not simply accept a low country widow as its queen on its terror king's word. The trouble wore the shape of Valmark's own strength, which made it worse. For Varric had a rival, as all such kings do, his own war marshal, a hard, ambitious old-blood lord named Droust, who had stood at the king's right hand through a decade of wars, and had come, in the long loneliness of Varric's reign, to think of himself as the kingdom's true strength, and the king as its mere seat, and who watched with narrowing eyes as his terror king came home from the south, soft-eyed over a green country woman with no blood and no name. He did it the way ambitious men do, in the space between words, letting it be known, quietly, in the hard halls of Valmark, that the king had bound himself to a common woman, a low country nothing, an innkeeper who would weaken the old blood and shame the high seat, that a kingdom carved out of black rock could not be ruled by a soft green thing from a road inn, and that a king who would set such a woman beside him had gone soft in the south and was, perhaps, no longer hard enough for the terrible north. It was a challenge dressed as concern, a bid for the seat dressed as loyalty to it, and it found ready ears, because Valmark was a hard place, and hard places distrust softness, and the whispers grew, through Sorrel's first year, into a thing that could not be ignored, that the Wolf King's low country queen was a weakness, and that a weakness in the high seat was a thing the old law of the North dealt with in old ways. It came to a head at a great gathering of the Valmark lords, where Droust, emboldened, said at last openly the thing he had been whispering, that the queen was no true queen, that the bond to a bloodless low country woman was a folly that shamed the North, and that if the king could not see it, perhaps the king too had been made soft, and perhaps the old law of challenge should decide who was hard enough to hold the black seat. It was very near an open bid for the throne, and the hard hall went silent and dangerous, and every eye turned to see whether the terror of the North would strike his war marshal down, or whether the softness Droust named had truly taken him. And it turned, too, on Sorrel, standing beside the seat, the green low country thing they were all, in that moment, deciding the worth of. And Sorrel, who had spent 2 years learning what it cost to be a thing that men decided the worth of, felt the old wound open and understood, standing in the black hall, that this was the Storm Knight's opposite, that where Varric had once seen over her wall, this whole hard kingdom was now trying to price her by it, to make her a weakness, a softness, a low country nothing, exactly the kinds of names the Moor Road had never quite dared call the Weatherwane's widow to her face. And she did the thing Maud had told her to do. She did not go hard to match them. She stayed green. She stepped forward, an innkeeper's widow in a hall of terror lords, unbidden, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not try to outhard the hardest men in the world, because she knew she could not, and knew, besides, that it was a trap, that the moment she tried to be as hard as Valmark, she would have lost the one thing that was hers. "Lord Droust says I'm soft," Sorrel said, and the black hall went still to hear the low country voice in it. "He says I'm a weakness in your high seat, a green thing from a road inn, no blood and no name, and that a hard kingdom can't be held by a soft queen. And I'll tell you plainly, he's half right, and it's the half he's wrong about that he ought to worry over." She looked at them, the hard lords, and 2 years of being priced by hard men on a lonely road made her, now, impossible to shame. "I am soft, if soft means I let a frightened stranger in, out of a storm when every sense said bar the door. I am soft, if soft means I kept a light burning on a dead road for 2 years when it would have been easier to close the inn and go. I am soft, if soft means I feed the thing that's hungry and warm the thing that's cold, and stay green in a place that wants me to go to stone. And I will not stop being that, not for this hall, not for the old law, not for the crown itself, because I have watched what your hardness has done to your king. I have watched the most feared man in the world so walled up in his own strength that a single night of being simply spoken to cracked him open like a drought-cracked field. Your hardness didn't make him strong, my lords. It made him alone. A kingdom of hard men made their king so hard he forgot how to be known, and called it strength, and it was slowly killing him, and none of you ever saw it, because you were all too busy being hard to notice that your king was starving. She turned, and looked at Droust, and did not flinch. You want to challenge for a soft king's seat, but you've mistaken the softness for the weakness. The green thing that grows where nothing should isn't the weak thing in this hall, my lord. It's the only thing here that isn't dying of its own hardness, and your king knows it. That's why he crossed a war to come south for it. Not because he went soft, because he was wise enough, at last, to want the one thing all your strength could never give him. And the black hall was silent, and Droust's hard face did something complicated. And Sorrel saw it, though he schooled it fast. Varric looked at her across the hall with an expression that was not a king's at all, that was naked and astonished, and something close to worship, the look of a man watching the person he loves refuse, in a hall of terror, to be made ashamed of the very thing that had saved him. The reckoning with Droust came, because such reckonings always come, and it was hard, and it nearly cost Sorrel everything, and it was the night that broke the last careful wall between her and the king. For Droust, unmade in the hall by a low country woman's plain words, did the thing that hard proud men do when shamed. He reached for the old law in earnest, and challenged, not the king, whom he now feared to face, but the bond itself, under an ancient and brutal custom of the North that Sorrel had never heard of, and that Varric had prayed she would never have to. That a bondmate whose worth was doubted could be put to the old trial, the proving, a thing of the deep winter and the high mountain, where the doubted mate must survive a night alone on the black peak in the killing cold, unbonded, with the tie to her mate deliberately closed off. For it was said that a true bondmate could survive the peak because some deep thing sustained her, and a false one could not, and Droust, who could no longer challenge the king, challenged instead the queen's right to exist, and demanded the proving, and the old law, terrible and ancient, was on his side, and even the king could not simply refuse it without confessing that he feared his own bond was false. The night before the proving was the worst night of Varric's life, worse than any of the war, and Sorrel understood, watching him, exactly how much he had come to love her, because she saw a terror king undone. He, who had never in his life been unable to solve a thing by strength, could not solve this one, because the only strength that would save her, his making war on the old law, was the very thing that would damn her in the eyes of the North as a queen who hid behind her king, and he knew it, and she knew it, and the two of them sat up the whole of that dark night in her cold rooms with the thing they could not fix sitting between them. And it was there, in the worst hours, that he told her the rest of himself, the parts even the cold gallery had not drawn out, told her, lo, of his own coming to the throne, of a father hard beyond cruelty, who had raised his heir to feel nothing, because feeling was weakness, and weakness was death in the North, of a boyhood spent being hammered into a blade, of the exact moment he had decided, at 14, standing over his father's body, that he would never let himself need a single living thing again, because everything he had ever been allowed to love had been used against him. And Sorrel had listened, and had understood that the wall she had built in 7 days of fever, the Terror King had built over 14 years of a father's hammering, that they were the same wound in 2 different sizes, and that the thing between them had never been the bond at all but this. Recognition. One walled and starving person seeing another across a fire, each knowing in the first breath exactly what the other had survived. "We're the same," she had said, in the dark, wondering. "You in your black hall and me on my dead road, 2 people who got taught so hard that needing gets you killed, that we built whole lives out of needing nothing. That's what the storm found. Not a bond. 2 people who'd each given up, and neither of us knew the other one was out there giving up too. And he had said yes, only that. And it had been the truest thing between them, and it had made the coming morning's cold peak, somehow, bearable, because whatever happened on the mountain, they had at least, on the night before it, finally told each other the whole of the truth. Sorrel chose to go. That was the thing that told the whole of Valmark what she was, and it was the thing that decided them. She did not have to, Varric offered, low and desperate, in the dark of her rooms the night before, to break the old law and make war on Droust and the custom both, rather than let her set foot on the peak. And she refused him, because she had learned, on a moor road, that a thing you win by having it fought for you is never truly yours, and she would not be a queen, the North thought had hidden behind her king. If I don't go, she told him, I'm exactly the soft, weak, hidden thing Droust says I am, forever, a queen who had to be protected from her own kingdom's law. I'll not live like that, Varric. I kept an inn alone for 2 years, on the loneliest road in the Low Country. I am not a thing that needs protecting from a cold night. Let me go and prove it, in my own body, so that no lord in this kingdom can ever again say the queen is a weakness. Because I would rather freeze on your black peak as my own woman than live warm forever as a thing you had to shield. And he had looked at her, and understood that this was the same woman who had bargained her way off her own threshold, who would not be handed even a rescue, and he had done the hardest thing a terror king ever did, which was to let the woman he loved walk up into the killing cold alone, because she had asked him to. Because he had sworn to ask and not decide, because he loved her enough to let her be the thing she was. And it nearly killed her. The peak was worse than any tale, a black spire of rock in the deep of the Valmark winter, the cold a living thing that reached into the body and closed its hand around the heart, and worst of all, the closing off of the bond, the deliberate silencing of the tie to Varric, so that for the first time since the storm night Sorrel could not feel him at all, was truly and utterly alone on the black peak in the dark, as she had never been alone even in her widowed years, and the cold came into her, and the aloneness came into her, and somewhere in the deep of that killing night she understood that she was going to die on Droust's mountain, that the old law was a murder dressed as a proving, that no bond and no stubbornness could hold a body against that cold. But she did not die, and the thing that kept her, in the end, was not the bond. The bond was closed, silenced, gone. But the thing that had always kept her, the thing Maud had named, the green, bitter, stubborn thing that grows where nothing should. She survived the peak, the way she had survived the dead road, and the widowed years and the walled loneliness. Not by being hard, but by refusing, with a stubbornness deeper than cold, to let the dark have everything. And there was a strange gift in the closing off of the bond, though she only understood it after, that because the tie to Varric was silenced on the peak, because she could not feel him at all, whatever kept her alive that night was hers, purely hers, no blood tie sustaining her, no Wolf King's strength reaching across the leagues, only Sorrel and the cold and the green stubborn refusal she had carried her whole life. So that when she came down alive she knew, past any doubt Droust or the old law or her own worst fears could ever raise again, that she had not survived because she was bonded. She had survived because she was Sorrel, who kept lights burning where no one came, who fed birds out of her own hunger, who stayed green, and the bond had had nothing to do with it, and that knowledge was worth more than the crown, because it was the final answer to the question that had haunted her since Maud's Croft, whether any of what she was, up in the north, was truly her own. It was. The peak had proved it. She was not a woman the blood had made. She was a woman who had walked into the killing cold with the blood switched off and walked out again, entirely herself. She thought of the light she had kept burning on the moor road. She thought of the bird she had fed out of her own hunger. She thought of the sprig of sorrel pressed in her book, the green thing that grows on the winter moor. She kept herself alive, hour by hour, on nothing but the same stubborn refusal that had let a lone woman keep a light on a dead road, and when the gray dawn came at last over the black peak, Sorrel of the Weatherwain was still alive on it, half frozen and barely breathing and entirely, unbreakably herself, and she came down off Droust's mountain on her own 2 feet, and the whole of Valmark, which had climbed the lower slopes to see whether the low country queen would live, saw her come down alive, and understood, all at once, that they had mistaken the green thing for the weak thing, exactly as she had told them, and that the stubborn low country stubbornness that grew where nothing should was harder, in the only way that mattered, than all their black stone. Varric reached her as she came off the last of the peak, having stood the whole night at the closed edge of the bond. In an agony she felt the echo of even through the silence, and the moment the old law's silencing lifted, the tie roared back between them so hard they both staggered with it, and he caught her, half frozen, on the mountain's foot, and neither of them let go. That was the thing. The proving was done, the danger was past, there was no need any more for the terror of the north to hold a half-frozen woman on a cold mountainside in front of his whole kingdom. And neither of them let go. And it was Sorrel, in the end, cracked-lipped and barely warm, who looked up at the hard, astonishing face of the man who had let her walk into the killing cold because she asked him to, and said, in a voice wrecked and raw and without a wall at last, "You let me go. You could have made war to keep me off that peak, and you let me go, because I asked you to. Do you know what that told me? It told me you're the only man who ever lived who loved me enough to let me be the thing I am, instead of the thing that's safe. Why?" And Varric, king of Valmark, the terror of the north, who had never in his hard life said a soft thing aloud, did not fail to say it now. "Because I spent 30 years being loved by no one, and feared by everyone," he said, low, certain, holding her on the cold mountain, "and I told myself that was strength, and it was only loneliness wearing a crown. And then a storm shut a pass, and I let a bond seal itself in a woman who let me in from the rain, and I told myself for a year that it was the blood that drew me, the old tie, a thing I couldn't help. It wasn't the blood, Sorrel. The blood only opened the door. What walked through it was you, the green stubborn thing that keeps a light on a dead road, that stays soft in a hall of stone, that would rather freeze as her own woman than live warm as a kept one. I didn't cross a war for a bondmate. Any bondmate would have been a stranger. I crossed it for you, the person, the one soul in the world who looked at the terror of the north and saw a lonely man in a wet shirt and let him in anyway. I let you walk up that peak because loving you means letting you be that, all of it. The softness and the stubbornness and the maddening refusal to be protected. And I would rather have you as you are and lose you to a cold mountain than keep you safe as something less than yourself. That's the whole of it. That's why." And there was nothing walled left in either of them. No terror and no caution. Only two people on a cold mountain who had each spent a life so well defended they had forgotten they were starving, and had found, in each other, the one person who could see over the wall. And when he kissed her, on the black mountain in the gray dawn, it was not a king kissing a subject, or a bond claiming its mate. It was only Varric, and only Sorrel, the stranger from the storm, and the widow who let him in, choosing each other at last with their walls down and their eyes open, which was the thing the bond had never been able to give them, and the thing they had, in the end, built for themselves. Old Maud did not live to see it. The herb woman had died the winter after Sorrel went north, old and blunt to the last, in her own croft among her drying herbs. But Sorrel kept her, the way you keep the one person who told you the truth when you needed it, and she planted, in the black stone of Valmark, in a warm corner of the High Queen's garden, where the mountain wind could not reach, a bed of sorrel, the bitter green low country herb she was named for, brought north as seed in the leaves of her small book, and she tended it herself, and it grew, green and stubborn, where nothing green should have grown, in the hard high kingdom of stone. And the Valmark folk, who had called her soft, came in time to understand what the green bed in the Queen's garden meant, and to be, in their hard, slow way, proud of it, the one green, stubborn thing that grew where nothing should, in the heart of the terrible north, because their low country queen had refused to let the stone have everything. It was 3 winters after the storm that Sorrel stood in the High Queen's garden of Valmark, in the first grey light, tending the sorrel bed against the coming cold, and listened to the rain that had begun in the night, drumming on the black stone roofs of the hall, and thought about the woman who had stood in a lit inn on a storm night, with the last mug in her hand, walled up so well in her own caution that she had nearly forgotten she was lonely. She was not that woman anymore, and she was, still, entirely that woman. That was the thing she had come to understand. The bond and the crown and the terrible North had not replaced Sorrel with someone grander. They had only, at last, let Sorrel be the whole of herself, the careful widow and the stubborn queen both, the one who had learned to keep a light on a dead road, and the one who could now stand green in a hall of stone. And she had found that the 2 walled years had not been wasted, that a person who has kept herself alive alone on a lonely road holds a crown differently than one who was always meant for it, more gently, more stubbornly, with a memory in the bone of what it is to be the last light burning where no one comes. Droust she did not have destroyed, though the old law and half the lords would have allowed it after the peak. She sent him instead to the far northern border, to keep the cold watch there, alive and stripped of his place at the seat, because she had learned on a lonely road that a thing you destroy becomes a grievance others gather around, while a thing you simply unmake and set aside becomes only a lesson, and she wanted his lesson to stand in plain view of the whole North for a long time. That the green thing they had all been so sure was the weakness, had walked up their killing mountain and walked back down, and that hardness is not the only kind of strong, and that the Queen of Valmark had proved it in her own half-frozen body, while the hardest lord in the north watched. She used her place gently. She had made Valmark, quietly, a little less hard, had brought the green thing into the stone, had let it be known that the terror of the North's own queen had kept an inn and fed the hungry and stayed soft on purpose, until, slowly, being green stopped being a shame in that hard country and started being a strength, and the whole cold kingdom warmed, a very little, around the low country woman who had refused to freeze. Varric came and stood beside her in the garden, the way he did, and they listened to the rain on the black roofs together, and after a while he said, quietly, the question he had never quite asked, the one he always left in her hands, "Do you ever wish the storm had never shut the pass? That I'd made the next inn instead of yours, and never come in out of the rain, and never bound you to a hard cold place, and a hard cold man, and a war on a black peak. You'd have kept your inn, your quiet, your careful life. Sometimes I think I blew in out of a storm and took a woman's whole quiet life from her before she'd even chosen it, and gave her a crown she never asked for and a mountain that nearly killed her, whether she'd have willed it or not." And Sorrel, who had made him swear to ask and not decide, and had learned to hold herself to the same law, told him the truth, in her own words, out loud, the way she had earned the right to. "You didn't take my quiet life," she said. "My quiet life was a wall. A good wall, built out of real grief. I built it stone by stone after Corin died, to keep from being hurt again, and it kept me safe, and it kept me half dead, and I was so good at it by the end that I couldn't even hear myself being lonely. You didn't take a life from me, Varric. You blew in, out of a storm, and cracked a wall I'd forgotten was a wall, and let me be alive for one night, and then the bond made me feel, for the first time in 2 years, that there was somewhere I was supposed to be." She turned to him, to the stranger from the storm who had let her walk up a killing mountain because she asked him to. "You asked if I wished the pass had stayed open. Here is my answer, in my own words, out loud, the way you always let me. No. I choose this. Not the bond. I didn't choose the bond. It was done to me before I knew. And that was a wrong. And we've spent 3 winters making it right by choosing each other over and over on purpose. But this, being known instead of walled up, being asked instead of decided about, staying green in a place of stone, standing in this garden in the rain with you, instead of turning the last mug alone on a dead road for the rest of my life. I choose all of it, the cold and the crown and the black peak, because it's mine, and it's true, and I am. And for once she did not let the sentence trail off the way she once would have. I am not a walled-up woman, keeping a light on a dead road anymore. I never truly was. I was only a green thing waiting for a storm to crack the stone I'd built around myself, and I would not trade 1 hour of this hard true life to be safely, quietly, carefully, half alive behind my own wall ever again. And Varric took her hand, and they stood together in the high garden of Valmark in the grey light, and the rain came down on the black stone roofs the way it had come down on her own slates the night he first walked in out of the storm. And Sorrel reached down, with her free hand, and picked a single leaf of the green stubborn sorrel that grew where nothing green should grow, in the heart of the terrible north, and held it in her palm the way she had once held an iron ring and 3 words on the back of a receipt, and understood that this was the whole of who she was and had always been. The green, bitter, stubborn thing that grows where nothing should, that keeps a light burning, that lets the stranger in from the storm, that stays soft in a hall of stone and alive against a killing cold, and that had come, at last, all the way north, out of a walled, quiet life on a dead road, into a hard, high kingdom where the rain drummed on black stone, exactly as it had drummed on her own roof the night everything changed. The same rain, the same green stubborn leaf in her palm, the same deep thing under her ribs that had once said come in, and had never, in 3 winters, once been wrong. The wall she had left behind on the moor road, fallen and forgotten, but the green thing she had carried north, and planted, and tended, and made to grow where nothing should, that was hers, and would be, to the last of her days, and no storm, and no stone, and no killing cold would ever take it from her again. She had kept a light on a dead road for 2 years, and thought it was for the travelers. She understood now it had been for herself, and for him, 100 leagues north keeping the same lonely light, 2 lights burning across a dark country for each other, before either knew the other was there. And the storm, in the end, had only carried one of the 2 lonely lights home, at last, across all that long dark country, to the other.